Hi and welcome to MIABC's December event, our final event of 2021. On behalf of the MIABC Board of Directors, we wish everyone, their families, and their companies the very best of the season. We hope that everyone stays healthy and well throughout the end of the year and into the future. We look forward to eventually returning to in-person events in 2021 and are monitoring and discussing the appropriate safe times and venues to begin that return. Stay tuned for future announcements. We have another great session for you today, and we are thankful to welcome back Wendy, Colin, and Carl for another great Altus versus CoStar commercial real estate outlooks discussion. Before I introduce our moderator, I'd like to thank our sponsor, ACM Advisors. ACM is an employee-owned investment fund manager focused exclusively on Canadian commercial mortgages. We now manage over $4 billion in assets for Canadian commercial investors, mainly pension plans, foundations, and endowments, and are currently funding approximately $1 billion per year. These are traditionally in loans ranging from $10 to $100 million, with some exceptions over and under. They're exclusively secured by commercial properties in major Canadian marketplaces for existing assets for term, bridge, and top-up second mortgages. You can either reach myself or any of my colleagues listed on our website, acma.ca, to connect. Thank you. And now on to our session. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Wendy Waters, VP Research and Strategy for GWL Realty Advisors, analyzing real estate trends and performance in the Canadian marketplace. Wendy brings over 15 years experience with GWL after previously being the Director of Research at Abitz & Young. With that, I'll hand it over to Wendy.
Okay, thanks, Graham, and thanks for having us back. I think we're looking forward to a lively discussion. For those who maybe weren't here last year, I'll introduce the panelists. So first, Carl Gomez, and I've known Carl for about 15 years as he used to lead the research team at Bentall. When between Bentall and GWLRA, we managed the BCIMC real estate across Canada. So we have fond memories of answering all of BCIMC's research questions and working on that together. Carl has since joined CoStar after spending some time with QuadReal when BCIMC took their real estate there. And at CoStar, he's now on, of course, the data and information side, so it makes a good rivalry with Altus. Carl's also an economist by training, so some of the questions I'm going to have for him are going to tap into that background. And many of you will be, pleased to know he's a former British Columbian or British Columbia resident. Colin Johnson has been with Altus for 30 years and has been the president of Research, Valuation, and Advisory since 2011. And there he leads over 350 appraisers, economists, planners, consultants, and data scientists to help answer all of the questions that we have about what's happening with real estate across Canada. He's one of Canada's leading valuation specialists, and his team has done over $350 billion worth of asset valuation in Canada over the past year. So questions to him are going to be along the lines of what is they've been learning, some insights he can provide all of us on trends and values, and how some of the other bigger trends that are affecting real estate markets and our world are affecting values. So the agenda here, as you can see, we're going to go through 4 asset types after these introductions. I've underlined office and multi-family housing. We're going to spend a little more time discussing those, but we're also going to have a Q&A. So if we miss your favorite questions, please put them into the Q&A and we'll get to them at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carl to take us through a brief overview of the office market, and then I have some questions for both Carl and Colin.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. And thanks, everybody, for having me. And thanks to my colleague, Colin. It's great to be on the other side of the ring again for a rematch. I think it was a draw the last time around. So hopefully it'll be a lot of fun this time around. Lots has changed, obviously, since we did this back in May. You can't talk about anything these days without still talking about the pandemic. And certainly, I think from a real estate perspective, the one asset class that really has seen the impact of the pandemic, probably directly, but you probably also see that in retail and the other ones as well. But the first slide I'm showing here is really where you can actually see the disconnect that's been happening with the office market. The graph on the left basically shows you our estimate of net absorption in Vancouver. That's the net amount of take up of space directly change in occupancy in Vancouver in general. So that's both the downtown and the suburban area. And also plotted with it is what I like to look at as a leading indicator of demand in the office sector. Basically, it's office job growth. It's the number of jobs in typical office using employment. And what's interesting about this graph is it really shows you that fundamentally speaking, Vancouver has continued to generate very strong job growth even through the pandemic. Everybody paused at the beginning of the pandemic early in 2020, but many companies, they shored up their balance sheets. They've done quite well. They've been investing, and so they've been hiring. And it's a tremendous amount of growth that we did see in hiring. On the flip side of that, however, usually it's about a 1 or 2 quarter lag between employment growth in the office sector and absorption. And we do see a very big delta emerging. And what that delta really shows you between office employment and net absorption is the fact that most people have been working from home. Have they been hired, or whether they were working originally, they've been spending their time at home. That demand impact, we think, is going to continue to carry through. Many companies are fundamentally changing the way they're looking at how they employ people. And so that is having an impact in the office market. One caveat I would say is that this is not as big an impact in Vancouver as it is in Toronto. A lot of that has to do with the fact that you're dealing with bigger companies, one in Toronto, that have to deal with big corporate policies, where it's a smaller tenant market in Vancouver. The other factor just has to do with the pandemic itself, with more concentration of cases in density area like Toronto. And so we have that situation happening. And the graph on the right basically shows you the other offset of this is the fact that many companies who have idle space have started to put on, or have been doing this since the beginning of the pandemic, is adding sublease space onto the market. Basically idle space that they're looking to recoup the cost of. And as this graph shows you on the right, basically we've seen a peak in that number. It happened at the end of 2020, and that number is now starting to gradually come down. So that's a very positive impact, and it correlates well with the fact that the pandemic is starting to wane. But you can still see that the number is still 32% down from 2021 Q1 peak, but it is above the 5-year average and still above the pre-pandemic average. So my takeaway on this, long story short, is that fundamentally, I think there is some demand impacts that are happening to the office market that is going to weigh down traditional demand and perhaps not see as big a recovery. Where that's happening is really concentrated in the downtown core. You can see the difference here between the downtowns and the suburbs. Right through the pandemic, we see negative net absorption in the city of Vancouver, but positive absorption in the suburbs. And I equate this to some extent with the relative densities in both of these geographic locations. A caveat here is that, if we look at Toronto as another litmus test of this, you see the exact same pattern emerge. So it is something that's, working its way through the system, not only in Vancouver, but Toronto, but also around the world, as, density has an issue. If we go to the next slide, while we talk about demand, the other factor here is the upcoming amount of new supply that's coming out of the market. Prior to the pandemic, even before we started here, Toronto, Vancouver both have the lowest vacancy rates in North America. And many developers had plans to start developing, a few years before that, anticipating that strong demand. And so guess what? We're in one of the strongest supply cycles right now. And here's just a list of upcoming arrivals in downtown Vancouver. One of the things that we're seeing is that when you look at the upcoming arrivals, many of them are high in demand. They're very efficient, great amenities that are going to be coming with some of these buildings as well, latest in design. But the pre-leasing numbers tend to be relatively low. And I think that's coinciding with the fact that we are starting to see that demand kind of falling off. So basically you have a very strong supply cycle coming in at a time when demand is fundamentally shifting. And if we go to the next slide, connecting the dots, basically where we see things going is you can see that availability has increased in Vancouver overall. This is for all of Vancouver, but we expect that given the moderation in demand that we're seeing, both from a cyclical and a secular level, and the amount of new supply, that we will continue to see vacancy rates creep up post 2022. So the story here is, something that is a transition from what was effectively a landlord's market for some years into something that's more favorable to the tenant market going forward. And that's generally our take of the office market.
Okay, thanks, Carl, for that quick overview. And I think for a question, I'm going to go back to the sublease slide, or the sublease comment that we had. And one of the challenges we've had, and I'm thinking maybe you two have had some thoughts on this, is the amount of sublease space, how much of it's real? In previous downturns, I'm thinking the tech wreck and the financial crisis, companies actually disappeared. People were left unemployed. So there were not people who needed desks and places to work. This time, as your other slide showed, we've had office-related employment growing, and yet all this sublease space. So wondering, if you've got some thoughts on how to explain it. Maybe we'll start with Carl on some thoughts on that, and maybe then I'll ask Colin about how you manage this amount of sublease space when you're thinking about valuations and buildings. But start with Carl.
Well, just very quickly, and then I'll turn it to Colin on my thoughts, is that I think some of this is fundamentally reflected in the fact that, back then, the tech wreck and other places, we didn't have this work from home option. The technology just wasn't there, but you see, banks and things like that function capably with people working from home. And so there are a number of, companies and their tenant reps making this decision about how much floor space do they really need, especially when they start bringing people back. Is it going to be part-time? Is it going to be flexible? And so I think that arithmetic is being worked out. But on the same side, you've got a lot of brokers sitting around doing nothing and people coming up. And so, they're putting on space, just to see what they can pick up. So there's a little bit of both that's happening. But I do see this, as I always have, as a good leading indicator of vacancy. Sublease space has always been a pretty good leading indicator of where actual vacancy ends up. So that's kind of my takeaway.
Okay, go ahead.
So Wendy, yeah, I'll jump in. So I think a few things. Before the pandemic, Vancouver is one of the strongest markets in all of North America. You can see that availability rate in 2019 just above 4%. So always had very, very strong fundamentals. I think the other slide that Carl showed, and Altus data reflects similar sort of numbers, is that the sublease space has stabilized and has sort of decreased down 30% from the end of the year. And so, but I will say that for a valuer like ourselves, it has had an impact on our cash flow modeling. In the beginning, higher TIs were supporting face rates because landlords wanted to keep the face rates where they were. And I would say now it's leading to still more muted rental growth. Before we had very strong rental growth and we were modeling that in. And I would just say that it's just really muted demand. And therefore, slower rental growth in our 10-year cash flow model, which has an impact. I would point out again that it's the downtown CBDs that have been most impacted as opposed to the suburbs. I think we can all agree that. One other thing you would see is perhaps a little bit of a flight to quality, the opportunity for a tenant, to move to a better building that's available for some sublease. But again, Vancouver is much different, as Carl pointed out, than Toronto or Montreal. It is a small tenant market. The impact in Toronto is significantly higher. We had the big four banks giving up multiple floors in some cases, and so that really did have an impact in a little bit on face rates and certainly on growth rates and for sure TI packages. But one thing when it comes to value is cap rates have held up remarkably well throughout this uncertainty. We've got lots of benchmarks in Vancouver, in Toronto, and Montreal that show that people are still wanting to buy good quality office buildings in the suburbs and downtown. As long as you've got term and you got covenant, cap rates haven't moved a lot. So the impact on values have been quite moderate for the kind of the top buildings. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So based on the income stream as opposed to the cap rate.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So thanks to you both. I've got a couple other office questions. Maybe I'll have time at the end, but we're going to move on in the interest of time to industrial. And Colin's going to take us through some of the stats, and then we'll get to a discussion.
Well, no surprise, things are pretty rosy. So if we look here, industrial availability continues to tighten everywhere in all markets. And if you take a look at Vancouver, basically there is no industrial space. And if we go across, if you can see from 2020, 2021, all through this, pandemic, again, a big part of it is e-commerce, logistics, fulfillment, et cetera, but very low vacancy rates. If we go to the next slide. So what has this led to? It has led to industrial rents spiking dramatically. And where the highest industrial rents? In Vancouver. You can see there the combination of net asking rent and additional rent. So you've got a gross rent of close to $23 in Vancouver, and a net rent of 16. You can debate, and I'm sure Carl would have slightly different numbers, but the trajectory is certainly consistent. I remember, being a Toronto guy, I remember net rents in Toronto were $6 for 20 years. And now all of a sudden they've gone up dramatically. And I think if you take a look at national rents, we've seen in some cases, 30% increase in rents over the last 3 years. So that's almost like 10% per year. That has a huge impact, particularly for us as a valuer, but also for those that are, occupiers as well. Next slide. So is it going to get any better? Are we going to get a little bit rental relief? No. In a word, because demand is still very, very strong and almost insatiable, and we're just not building enough space. I think we've got about, you can see in total around 30 to 33 million that's under construction right now. A lot of it's spoken for already. Those red dots show the availability rate. So 55% of the 33 million under construction nationally is already spoken for. And in Vancouver, again, building somewhere between, 3.5, 4.5 million square feet. And again, the availability rate, unfortunately, 25%, okay? Because 75% of it's spoken for. So all this leads us to believe that, in pretty much all markets, rental growth is going to continue to be quite strong. Next slide. And then you start to get into not all buildings are created equal. And this is an availability either for sale or for lease based on ceiling clear height. So when we think logistics and you think Amazon, you think, wow, you really need the big clear height. So yes, you do, but there's a little bit of misnomer there, because what you really want for industrial and for logistics is last mile delivery. So I'm sure Carl would agree that, we see a lot of buildings that are 18 to 24 foot clear. Some of those listings actually being gobbled up for logistics and delivery, because some of them are more urban locations, and you take what you can get. And I think that's one thing that we are seeing, and that's why we're seeing rental growth in pretty much all asset classes, not just the really good clear height ones, but also the ones that are a little bit lower in clear height. And do we have another one?
No, well, we've got my slide of, to bring the Toronto people up to speed.
Jump the gun.
Yeah, up to speed on, and ask your opinion as a valuer on this. So bring you guys up to speed on one of the new proposed developments in Vancouver, which is at Marine Gateway 2, and it's to, combine industrial with residential housing, and obviously it looks like a bit of retail in this rendering. So mixed use, Vancouver's doing obviously multi-story. We've also now got mixed use industrial. How do you react, Colin, as an appraiser to this? What does it do to the value of buildings like the Subaru dealership, which is obviously going to become this? What are your group finding or thinking?
Yeah. Well, when you showed me this slide, I laughed and I said, I don't value based on renderings. I value based on pro formas, but I'm assuming there is a very detailed pro forma behind this. And we absolutely will take that into consideration. Industrial mixed use, not necessarily a new concept for Vancouver. I think, the scale of the development is going to test, perhaps the depth of the market a bit. But we have seen mixed use industrial in Asia, and just like we saw, multiple floor industrial in Asia before it became new to North America. I think it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. But I think we can all agree that we expect more mixed use, and traditionally it has been mixed use. It's been office and retail and res, but based on this insatiable demand for industrial, and the fact that there's, we're not making any more new land, and there is a real shortage of land. And as we know, land prices are being driven up for industrial space, with industrial developers competing with res developers. Because to be clear, they all want to be close to an urban population. So not surprised by it, but I would love to see the detailed pro forma and just see how big those rents are and how low those cap rates are that they're performing.
Okay, I'm sure we probably don't have someone from PCI in the room that we could ask. So Carl, I guess we're thinking, I mean, industrial rents going really high. We could talk about, maybe we will in a minute, whether they can keep going up. But as an economist, are you looking for certain indicators to tell you that these rents can keep going up, or we're going to hit a ceiling?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, particularly these days, and I'll maybe segue into the inflation story in a second. But one thing I wanted to say about Vancouver as well, there is traditional user demand, industrial users demanding industrial, and that's helping to drive demand. Vancouver's not a traditional industrial market anymore. A lot of the logistics guys and people have jumped the Rockies and gone to Calgary. And Calgary has actually now become more of the logistics distribution area for Western Canada. So when I look at industrial in Vancouver, their rents almost reflect more a land play than anything else. It's the underlying land that is really driving that. And so what you're also seeing now in Vancouver is all this industrial strata. And so it's a play on the land, it's a play on real estate as well. Not to say that there isn't industrial uses that are going on, but more and more Vancouver is becoming that sort of industrial market. The question about rents is a good one, because I think everybody's asking themselves these days at cap rates where we're seeing sub 3% cap rates in Vancouver, sometimes even as low as 2%. How far can rents go? And my answer is, from a traditional industrial standpoint, if you look at a user like a distribution company, transportation costs typically account for about half of an occupier's total logistics costs. However, that figure can easily rise to about 70%. While their fixed facility costs, which include real estate rent, account for only 3 to 6%. So when you do the math there, a lot of these logistics users can pay astronomical rents because they really, really want to be close and reduce their transportation costs. And so from that perspective, Colin mentioned, Toronto always being a $5-6 market. I remember maybe about 4 or 5 years ago being questioned how we could even grow to $8. And I said, no, look, the demand is really, really going to be there for this stuff. And nobody could believe it. We had some old timers there who'd been in Toronto. No one's going to do it. Well, here we are past $10. Vancouver's at 20. I think this is a trend across the board, because just-in-time inventory has become just-in-case inventory for a lot of these guys. And so the food inflation that we're seeing, the inflation consumer-wise, is really a reflection of the fact that we can't get goods to people, and people need places to store these goods. It's an inventory supply chain issue. Okay,
great. So I'm going to end the industrial with a bit of a lightning round. So Colin's data had net rents at 1660, 2290 gross, I believe. So a year from now, where are industrial rents in Vancouver? So if you value percentage up, or if you want to, because you guys don't work off the same base data, percentage or a number. Colin.
7 to 10%, somewhere in there. Pick your number in there. 7 to 10.
7 to 10% higher. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with Colin. I was thinking about 8% based on some math, but I'm actually thinking more 10% these days.
Okay. So there we go, somewhere in that 7, 8 to 10% range for next year. We'll find out. Okay, retail. So I think we are going back to Carl to talk about retail.
Sure. And, I was talking about the pandemic influence on office, and it's certainly there. Well, we all know that the pandemic influenced retail. Due to the shutdowns, the restrictions, the data is very, you can see it bruised by it. I have a graph here on the left that just looks at Canada broadly, in terms of, what core retail sales, which excludes, stuff like automobile and gas. So it's really the stuff that's sold in the stores for the most part. You can see the impacts of the first wave, the second wave, the third wave. But consumers keep coming back, and they keep spending as they come out of these restrictions and lockdowns. What's great about Vancouver is that, you guys can deal with as many of the restrictions and enclosures as we did here in Toronto or in Montreal and other places. And so, things started to open up a little sooner in Vancouver. And that's why when you look at retail sales by region, Vancouver and Nova Scotia have been leading the pack in terms of growth. You look down at the bottom of that ledger, you can see that hard impacted Toronto and Ontario are down at the bottom. So retail spending, the good news is it is in recovery right now, especially in Vancouver, and we've made up the lost ground that we saw in the pandemic over the last while. So we're well above the pre-pandemic levels. If we go to the next slide, My prediction here is that I think we're in a good news cycle for retail, and there are two reasons. One is, no doubt we saw a secular increase in e-commerce spending, but when you look at e-commerce spending, it's only about 5 to 10% of where people spend. The rest of it, the 90 to 95, is in stores. And certainly during the lockdowns, we saw a spike up. And even my 80-year-old dad was like shopping online, and he loved it. He learned how to do it. And, he was ordering everything, maybe a little too much, including candies for my daughter. But at the end of the day, people still like going to stores. And you can see as the lockdowns, fell off, we started to see retail sales, or the amount of sales happening on e-commerce, come down. But here, to me, this is the real smoking gun about why people are going to spend. Through this pandemic, the household savings rate has jumped up dramatically. We haven't seen as high a household savings rate since prior to the 1990s. There's a huge stockpile of cash that people have stored up. Now, part of this has to do with government transfers, but a good chunk of it is also people were just saving money. I mean, you weren't commuting to work, you weren't going out for dinners, you weren't doing a whole bunch of stuff. That money just sat in your bank account. And so here we are with a lot of cash, a lot of pent-up demand, and I think that's really going to come through to retail. Go to the next slide. When we look at physical retail, though, one of the things that has happened is that when you think through the pandemic, people still needed their food, they still needed their drugs, they still needed their alcohol. And so, neighborhood centers, which have a lot of that sort of tenant base in them, continued to see steady demand through the pandemic. Where retail really got hit was mostly in the enclosed centers, the malls, community malls, things like that, where people weren't shopping for clothes, they weren't going into food courts, and we saw a lot of retailers just simply go bankrupt or shut down stores. Starbucks was a case in point. They just wanted to save some money, so they shut down a whole bunch of stores. The good news is we're starting to see that recovery happening in malls now. We're starting to see the opening up, and spaces being taken up again. We're definitely seeing it in strip centers as people start to be around communities and things like that. And that neighborhood center remains a stalwart for demand. So, my takeaway from this slide is that retail is not going anywhere, physical retail. It's still there. It's changing, as it always has. And this pandemic has really accelerated a lot of the changes that are happening. Retail isn't going anywhere. It's still there. Next slide. And from that perspective, I think what's even more interesting is looking at retail investment transactions. We've seen, steady activity in neighborhood centers. That's been traded largely by smaller investors and things like that. We have seen also, relatively healthy trading in strips. Nothing going on in malls, as we all know, because the landlords are too busy trying to, get the rent in and shore up tenants. But where the transaction activity has really been taking place, and I think this is fascinating, is a lot of general retail. And in that general retail includes auto dealerships, street front retail, various little parcels of land plays that developers are accruing so that they can build density. And I think that's the real story with retail. Nobody's going to be making pure play retail anymore, but what they are doing is stapling on retail to other uses to create some density and to create some income. So the real evolution of retail, in my mind, is all about mixed use. And you've got that here, right here, the amazing Brentwood. Every shopping redevelopment that's going on is creating some sort of avenue of mixed use, experiential. It's all about placemaking. And you're seeing that across the board, not only in Vancouver, but across North America. So there are so many elements of this that are coming back. And that's why I say, physical retail is not dead. It's just really transforming.
Yeah, as I say, it's boring retail is dead, experiential retail. Obviously, in the Vancouver market, we have a lot of similar projects to the amazing Brentwood coming on. I mean, Oakridge is a little bit different because of its location and sort of the stature of that mall, but Coquitlam Center, I believe, Lougheed Center. Is there a saturation point? Like, how many experiential malls can a region the size of sort of Greater Vancouver handle? And either one of you want to jump in, and there's also probably an appraisal question because how much more density like this can obviously the res density we can handle. We have a shortage, but the retail change.
I'll jump in, but I'm very interested to hear Colin's take on the appraisal side. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, experiential is a very qualitative word. And, you know, for some developers who may not be as creative, you know, throw in a food court, throw in, you know, a few things here or there, throw in, you know, long tables for people to eat communally. That worked before the pandemic. You've created experience. Well, you know, you can't create experiences that are commodities. And so if everybody is doing this sort of stuff, then it's not as an experience anymore. It's a commodity. So it really depends to me, you know, being a real estate guy, on location, you know, where you're drawing in the most number of people, what other amenities are you bringing in? And those retail centers will do the best. It comes down to location and demographics, quite frankly.
Yeah, I'll just build on some of Carl's comments there. You know, maybe one of these per X 100,000 people, or one, you know, per major neighborhood. These do draw further. They have, you know, because of the experiential nature, they tend to have a bigger drawing radius. The thing about these is it takes a long time it takes a while to play out, whether you can call them a success or not. You know, some lease up quicker than others. It depends about getting your anchor tenancies. All the anchors, I mean, they all sort of look the same to a degree. If you get, you know, I saw some recent reports by Deloitte and McKinsey and KPMG, and they all talked about the importance for unique restaurants, green space, multiple parking options, areas for centralized returns and pickup, centers that embrace technology and digital tools and become a destination meeting place for the community, where there's a combination of leisure, office, residential, and cultural, with pop-ups and exhibitions. It all says the same stuff, and these are all going to look fairly similar.
Yeah.
Because all the consultants are saying that's what you should build. That's how you get a true destination neighborhood. And I'll just say this: they won't all have the same level of success. Wendy, I think, to, you know, a little bit of an analogy, the Mills concept, when they put it in Toronto, Vaughan Mills did very, very well. Then when you put one in Tsawwassen, and it has been a somewhat different story, right? Weaker traction, a number of, you know, it's not comparing apples to apples, but similar concepts very much. But as Carl said, the location is pretty critical, and your access and a bunch of other things. But I'll just say that, yeah, there's only so many of them you can probably have, but and time will play out. But interesting concepts, and you're right. Nobody's going back to the same old mall, just like nobody's going back to the same old office building.
Exactly.
Yeah, fair enough. And Carl and Colin, sorry, believe you agree with Carl in the sense that a lot of retail sales have been land plays, they've been, you know, future development plays, and have you been sort of valuing some purchases on that basis?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got a lending audience here. I think when I'm talking to some lenders and I'm talking about secondary or tertiary malls, they're saying, Colin, I don't believe give me what the underlying land value is, because half these tenants are on percentage rent and you're never backfilling these two vacant anchor stores. So not all retail is necessarily a redevelopment. If you look at, you touched on some already, but if we look at, you know, Guildford, you know, Richmond Center, Oak Ridge, places like that, there absolutely is residential opportunities there, and it's priced in, and it's one of the reasons why those are attractive, and why there's liquidity for those assets, and there's a value add play. But there are some that that value add play is just not there, right? And so some of them are just, you know, they may be functionally obsolete as retail, but it's not clear they're going to be a total mixed use development. And we'll see how that plays out.
Just touch to Colin's point. A lot of what we see in those retail transactions are just like auto dealerships and things like that. That stuff is land. Yeah.
Okay, before we move to multi-res, but we're getting a little behind schedule, so I've skipped over one thing, but I am going to do the retail lightning round. I wanted to ask you each, what was the strangest thing that your household bought online during the pandemic?
The strangest thing.
Strangest thing that showed up your house. So you didn't buy it. Maybe someone in your household, or maybe it's Carl's dad bought something.
My daughter went on a major crystal thing. So we're getting, you know, teenage daughter. She was getting, you know, she was all about opening my chakras and finding my chakras, and we had the crystals coming from Amazon.
Okay, crystals.
Crystals, yeah.
All right, Carl.
So we bought a rainbow unicorn water slide. And that was last summer, and my daughter is just fascinated by unicorns. We actually found a rainbow unicorn blow up slide that slides right into the pool, and she was enjoying that all summer.
Okay, there we go. E-commerce at its finest. All right, with that, we'll move on to multi-residential, and Colin's going to take us through some of the Altus stats.
Yeah, so quickly, and not necessarily Altus stats.
Oh, you're right.
Again, we can go with rentals.ca. We can talk about Zonda. We can talk about, but we put this up for illustrative purposes. And this tells you average monthly rents, by province. And I think you can take a look, see how BC has, fared compared to Ontario, right? Ontario was a big dip in asking rents, has recovered, but nowhere near, not back to where it was. Whereas BC fared, quite differently. And, again, you can go across by market, and you can see by province. But I think I just focus on that contrast there between Ontario and BC. And then if you go to the next slide, again, rentals.ca talking about Vancouver, Victoria, and Burnaby, I highlighted. I saw Zonda's recent stats where they actually said that Victoria is now in second place, bypassed Toronto. Different data, and it depends. When you're looking at asking rents, exactly what you're comparing. But I think you look at the strength comparatively of BC, and we touched on it earlier that immigration did fall off. Immigration really fell off. Toronto gets 150,000 immigrants a year. I know Vancouver gets a good bunch as well, but Ontario was definitely hurt. And you can see the growth rates in Toronto, Oakville, Burlington year over year are very much single digit, and in Vaughan and Mississauga. Whereas if you could compare, Vancouver, Victoria, double digit. And I think Carl, you had a theory as to why Burnaby was showed this number. But again, I think just comparing and contrasting, the rental market in Vancouver very strong, and maybe that's why we continue to see these cap rates in the 2% and 3% level. Next slide. So this is important because we underbuilt purpose-built rental for over a decade, and you can see there in blue, 2007 through to let's say 2015, 2016, we were building 18 to 20,000 a year. Then I guess 2015, 2016, we started to get into over more than 30,000. You'll notice though, in recent years, we are really, part of the desire has been, and perhaps maybe it's been the weakening of regional malls and pension funds really getting into purpose-built rental. But you will see, we're building a lot of purpose-built rental in comparison to, to condos now. It's really, it's quite an interesting trend. And even during the pandemic, right, we were still building a lot of purpose-built rental in comparison to the condo. So I think that's an interesting trend and one that's changed quite a bit over the last few years. And Wendy, you put this slide together, and you had an interesting comment on this one.
Yeah, well, there's a few things. So this just comes out. We have a housing dashboard we keep at GWLRA, looking at what's under construction, condos, the dark blue at the bottom, rental, the red, and then the green, sort of everything else, which would be like owner occupied, kind of ground oriented. And what's interesting, one is Vancouver is building about half as many as Toronto, but the city is about 1/3 the size. So on a per capita basis, there's actually more housing going up in Vancouver. Given we still have a shortage, there's been pent up demand for years for housing. That's a good thing for Vancouver. It's probably also an omen for Toronto that there needs to be more construction. And you can see also the number of rental units under construction in both Vancouver and Toronto. It's about 10,000 in each one. So building about the same amount of rental. Again, Vancouver very undersupplied of the larger, institutional owned purpose-built rental. So it's probably good news for renters that this is coming.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And this slide we just put in, I had this earlier in the year, and we compared 2020 and 2019. So we just did this. This is year to date after 3 quarters, and it's new condominium apartment sales by the submarket in the GVA. And you'll just notice the year over year trend. And if you look at in the pie chart, those green sections, right, you can see in 2020, 17%, was green, which was the sort of the Surrey Delta, the White Rock. And then if you take a look, significantly more in 2021. And you just look at the absolute volume, we shouldn't be surprised, everything halted for several months when the pandemic was on. But just the surge in Burnaby, New Westminster, and the Surrey Delta, White Rock, pretty significant. And I think definitely worth highlighting.
That's an interesting slide, because when we were talking about the difference between Toronto and Vancouver, Vancouver is actually seeing a lot more supply being developed in the suburbs. That's not the case in Toronto. Most of Toronto's new supply is being concentrated in the downtown core. So that explains a big part of the per capita difference, I think, between the two.
Yep.
Yeah, it's easier to develop and more land and so forth. Also, I was thinking about this as there's supply and demand going on here, because these are apartment sales. The fact that there's more opportunities, there's more units available in pre-sales in the suburbs. Supply constrained market may be part of it. That some of that spending may have gone to a inner core area had there been an opportunity in, say, downtown, but there isn't. Okay, I think sorry, back up here. Stay there for a second. So some questions, and we haven't touched on rent control, which affects both British Columbia and Ontario. So rental rate growth assumptions, Colin, in a rent controlled world, how do you manage those? Because obviously on turnover, we can get higher rents, newer product can lease up at higher rents, but then there's the rent control. So do you have any way you look to try to manage this rent control on existing units and
it's
turnover?
a big thing, and you're not comparing apples to apples. When you look at cap rates, the concern is when you see a really low cap rate on a building that perhaps doesn't have that rental growth upside. And that's a concern for us when we model. But yeah, definitely, our typical market rent growth assumptions in the sort of range of 2 to 3%, and that captures the older and newer rental growth trends in the market. But the lower end of the range really considers properties with limited upside, whereas the upper end is really the older rentals that haven't been upgraded a lot in the past, but there's an opportunity to do that, probably get some churn and get some higher rents. But as you point out, there are some limits. And so that's the concern for us as valuers, is we really dive into the historical suite turnover. We look at what the rental growth upside is, and has there been much in the way, have they been upgraded to suites in recent years or not? And is very much, as opposed to a macro viewpoint, it's very much, property by property, neighborhood by neighborhood. And, one property in the same neighborhood, doesn't necessarily have the same kind of rental growth opportunities, but you can benchmark where the potential rents can be, because the rents are similar in neighborhoods. And so that's what we look to. So it's really comparative that way, Wendy. But it is, if you're going to ask me what's my crystal ball for rental growth, it's a lot different answer than for industrial, right? One, it's constrained, but two, my crystal ball is not so clear.
Yeah, fair enough. On the turnover of suites and the upgrading, Carl, I'm wondering whether you've had a chance to look into the CoStar data on ownership and turnover of ownership of apartments. That there's been, some controversy to Vancouver about what's called the financialization of apartments, in the sense of maybe some of the REITs and some, buying older buildings, fixing them up. I'm wondering if you have any data on that, because CoStar has a very good data set on who the actual owners are of buildings.
We do, and we have dug into it. It's called, True Owner, and we've been able to go beyond the numbered company and kind of figure out who's there. One thing that we have seen is that, the apartment market, the traditional apartment market, has been predominantly in the hands of small private investors. And, when we talk about rent control, many of them have taken the old sort of, approach of, charging 2% rent growth, but letting the property slide, because the capex on these properties are huge. So it's kind of ghetto control kind of thing where the landlord does that. I think they've many of them have started to get to a point now where they want to cash out, because there's a lot of capital on the sidelines. But at the same time, you have, institutional investors, REITs, that are looking to create value, redevelop. But, it's not just about creating income, it's about creating value. And so you are starting to see that transition happening out of some of these older guys who are looking to capitalize on what they have there that haven't invested, and these other institutions that are coming in, to be able to redevelop. It's not been an easy game, I think, for a lot of this sort of stuff, because again, you can't get your head around certain numbers, but certainly I think that's starting to happen. On the flip side, you're also seeing, while institutions are developing rental buildings, I have seen through some discussions with smaller clients, small number of small private REITs, club deals, things like that, developing small rental as well. There's a huge onus on doing new stuff. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that rent controls on the old stuff doesn't make that valuable from an investment standpoint. But if you can develop something newer and get higher rents right off the bat, and it, depending on what jurisdiction you're not subject to rent control, then there you go, and you don't have the pain of trying to redevelop an existing building. So there is a little bit of that's going on too.
Yeah, well, certainly in Vancouver for institutions, a lot of the lot sizes for building rental in the Vancouver market, including some of the suburbs, are also often quite small. We struggle to find sites big enough for an institutional redevelopment. So it makes a lot of sense that it's some of the private groups that are continuing to be the developers. Okay, before we move on to Q&A, just a quick lightning round. So post COVID, during COVID, we've seen a bit of a shift to the suburbs. Where's the housing going to be? Condo, rental, urban, or suburban? What do you think, Colin? Are we going to see more of the suburban trend post-COVID?
Yeah, I think Carl pointed out there's a difference between the Greater Vancouver area and the Greater Toronto area, and I think you can expect to see those, maybe not at the same velocity, but I think the suburbs, and I think you're going to be looking south.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's going to be more traction towards the suburbs, but when I say that, it doesn't mean that it's just going to rob the downtown. I think the two can coexist. It's just that the pendulum is swinging, a little bit back from the other direction of all urban, all transit oriented, all that. There is a bit of a shift happening, and it's not just the pandemic. The demographics were leading us there even before the pandemic as well.
Okay, thank you so much. So we're going to switch over to Q&A, and as I think Graham's going to come in, and I think there's places where people can type in questions, Graham. But maybe while we're waiting, I've got one thing I wanted to bring up, for this group. So Graham, did you want to give people any directions? You're on mute.
Still mute.
Okay, sounds like we're having technical difficulties. So I will move on and hope that some Q&A shows up. Yeah, so obviously in this region, we had major climate-related storms, or what most people believe is somewhat climate-related storms, and the flooding in Abbotsford. And I think, what we have these two on, looking at what this might do to valuations. Does it? It's the 1 in 200 year flood. Maybe it'll be another 200 years, or 1 in 50 year flood. Maybe it'll be another 50 years. But so this is just a shot of an exit that probably a lot of people on this webinar are familiar with. It's sort of the last exit where you get cheap gas before you go into the Lower Mainland and the transit tax. Castle Fun Park, a lot of gas stations. And then there's a little shopping center over here, which I got a picture of it on the other side. And this is not one that we're associated with. I do not know who owns this one. It was just it was sort of an interesting one just to take a look at. So if you do own it on the line, I apologize. How would you value this before? How do you value it now? The water came pretty much right up to the edge of the mall. I don't know whether there was an extensive water damage, but I'm sure there was a little bit. So maybe Colin, just some thoughts on climate change and
let's state the obvious. Castle Fun Park doesn't look very fun. Not to be flippant. Okay, so if there's one thing you take away from me saying on this seminar, hopefully write this down. Google climate risk and commercial property values, and what's going to come up is a study by Henley Business School in conjunction with Schulich Business School and our friend Jim Clayton, which many of you know. It's a 71-page article, and it's about climate risk and property values. It talks about pricing, implications for CapEx, implications for operating expenses. It talks about flood, hurricanes, sea level rises, wildfire, and it tries to address liquidity issues, risk premiums. It tries to give the perspective from the insurers and the lenders, and it talks about cash flows and cap rates. And unfortunately, the article points out there's not enough empirical data yet. There's a lot more that's being done on the residential side, Wendy. and a lot of, Europe's further ahead. America's a little bit further ahead. We're lagging a little bit. It is, it is a challenge without a doubt. And what we've seen in valuations is typically there's a sharp drop in value after an event like this, but it tends to come back. But that's not the right answer. And, things are valued under, a 10-year investment horizon, and that's the way they should be. But I would just say this, that I've started to talk to some people who are buying properties, if they be in, California, where there's concerns about earthquakes, or whether there's flooding in certain places or wildfires. And they're saying, maybe I need a higher exit cap rate, a terminal cap rate, than a going in cap rate to quantify the risk. And maybe my internal return has to be a little bit higher, or maybe a bunch higher for those sorts of properties. So I think there's that that impacts the capital value. There's also cash flow assumptions as well. So it absolutely can. But Jim, I'll just end with this. Jim points one good question out. He says, do appraisers and valuers have the sort of interdisciplinary skill set to kind of do this? And he says, I'm not sure if they do. And it's a good point. So I'll just leave it at that. More to come.
Yeah, a lot more information to come. And I think in the next year or two, we're going to see a lot more data, a lot more information, and a lot more interest in these questions. Do we have some other questions, Graham? We're doing sign language. I guess we've okay, having problems. Okay, I've got more questions. So I want to go back to an office question I didn't get to ask because I was a little concerned about time, and it also relates to climate change. Just gonna find this here. But this is more on the going to net zero. We've seen a lot of net zero pledges come out from various institutions, and some buildings are going to be better positioned to reduce their carbon than other buildings. There's also the question of whether you're going to get a rental rate premium, or you're going to be taking some sort of rental hit if you don't. So I'm just wondering if maybe, for Colin, I think that the question is just, are you starting to look at emissions? Are you starting to look at the path to net zero in terms of the valuing of buildings? And then I think for Carl, it might be whether those in CoStar, do we see any different premiums on rents or anything from the very few buildings, or maybe it's the LEED Platinum buildings that we can use as a proxy. So I'll start with Colin and then go to Carl.
I'll be quick, because I'll just say the answer is yes. We look now at CapEx plans and operating budgets. We ask the questions, particularly important for older office buildings. Office is easier to do. There's sensors. I will say this, in New York right now, there's going to be fines put on buildings. I was talking to some people, the Empire State Building, who spent a lot of money, is going to get fined because of carbon emissions. They just cannot. That's going to be like several $100,000 a year. That's going to, in the next few years, flow into the cash flows as they try and keep with it. So that's going to impact values. So yes, Wendy, we are starting to look at it. And I think that, as you pointed out, it can be a triple hit. It can hit, your operating expenses are going to be higher if you're not efficient. Your cap rate's going to be higher because you're not going to have many people wanting to buy your property, and so there'll be less liquidity. So that'll be higher. And then you've got CapEx as well you got to spend. So there's 3 areas where it can potentially hit in value, and we are starting to look at it a little bit more. But we try not to set the market. We're just going to reflect the market, and these things take time to play out. Over to Carl.
To your point, Wendy, I think this is the flight to quality thing, but it's much more of a secular flight to quality. More energy efficient buildings, the ones with the better HVACs, the ones that are much more better fitted towards net zero, are seeing demand and rents create a delta with those that don't have it. And I expect, as we move in the post-COVID era, where more and more companies are going to demand things for their own good governance sort of positioning, that's going to be along the lines of, energy efficient buildings, things that have a low carbon footprint, but also, flexible space that is more modern. So I think we are going to continue to see that the top quality buildings continue to see a premium over the other ones, and that delta is going to widen over time. Quite frankly, I think for the office market, it's really those older buildings, those ones that are less energy efficient, the ones that aren't as flexible, that are really going to have to be redeveloped. There's no other question. Calgary is a different story, but I think a lot of them are going to have to be redeveloped into other uses.
Okay, yeah. So to call in sort of the rising, OPEX going up, CapEx going up, cap rates going up. You may see rental rates going down on some buildings if they don't do that. Okay, I guess we are at the top of the hour. Hopefully Graham's got his audio worked out so
Hopefully.
he can direct us as to what happens next. I hear him. That's great. So Graham, take it away.
Well, I want to say thank you very much, all three of you, for coming back and presenting with your knowledge of your organizations and everything that you've collected. And thank you very much. I know how hard you've worked on putting this all together, and very much thank you on behalf of the Mortgage Investment Association of BC, both the members and the board of directors especially. Thank you very much for having us with this closeout 2021 session today. So, and I want to remind everyone that joined that the full webinar has been recorded and will be available afterwards if you were unable to log in until a little bit in the middle of the session. So that is available, and we will be distributing that shortly. Also, want to thank our sponsor, ACM, for sponsoring today's session. I also want to thank the rest of the board of directors for all their work this year, for putting together events for the association. We couldn't do it without your membership sponsorship, and looking forward to being able to put together great sessions such as we had today with such great high caliber people. So we're very, very thankful to you again for being able to donate your time and expertise to the organization and the industry at large. So thank you very much again. And I would also like to remind everyone that there is a post-webinar mingler set up on MS Teams. I know the link is working because I'm getting the notifications that people are joining, so fantastic. We'll be there for more of an interactive discussion. So thank you again, everyone, and especially to Wendy, Carl, and Colin. Huge thanks from the MIABC.
Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays.
Take care.
I think we don't have a link to the Teams. If you wanted us to go into the mingler, someone should
I'll
email
send it to you.
The three of us the Teams link.
Perfect.
Okay.
Excellent.
Right, guys, I can't make the mingler, but you can see me as well. Take care.
Sorry, I can't mingle either, Wendy. You'll have to mingle for all three of us.
Oh, okay. I will mingle and do my best to channel both of you and answer questions. Okay.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Perfect. Thank you. Happy holidays, everyone.